Gospel comes from the Gospel of Matthew, and there we read. Jesus said, "You've heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that if you're angry with your brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' you will be liable to the hell of fire." And we're just going to stop right there today. Let us pray. Lord, may your words only be spoken and your words only heard. We do ask this all for your love's precious sake. Be seated. Now, clearly today's gospel goes on, and I hope that you'll read the rest of it. It addresses some additional important topics. Additionally, the first reading today, always in your bulletin insert, there's several readings. This first reading from Deuteronomy, which you'll find here, is also a powerful reading. Ties in very nicely to what Jesus is talking about, we'll talk about today. So I commend your reflection on that as well. But it seems to me these first two verses give us plenty to think about, plenty to focus on, and I don't want anything to dilute that focus. So that's why we're stopping where we're stopping, and we're putting our focus right there, and we're just sticking right there. We're sticking with anger. And I would say, and you know that sometimes you hear me talk about how destructive alcohol can be in people's lives, and I say that on the basis of my life in ministry and having heard just so many stories of so much heartbreak. But I would also say immediately and without reservation that if I had to reflect on the single most destructive force I have seen in my 33 years as a priest, and in fact my 61 years as a human being, it would be anger. And when you think of anger, we often think of the extroverted anger, the person who rages, the person who blows a fuse, the person who, who is very loud. But there is also introverted anger. And introverted anger is that cold, cruel anger. And its hallmarks are silence, withdrawal, and ultimately abandonment. And again, not to make light of physical abuse, it's a terrible thing, always a terrible thing, it's always heartbreaking, great tragedy. But with physical abuse, people learn to see it coming. And again, not to diminish it, not to, in any way, shape, but and people will often begin to be able to put it in its place. But abandonment, emotional withdrawal, that's far more subtle. And sometimes people don't realize the way that so significantly impacts them in their life and becomes a legacy that gets passed on and on and on. And then there's even a third form of anger, and that's anger turned in towards ourselves. And that's when anger becomes self-destructive. And most of the time when this happens, people aren't in touch with this anger, but they begin to act out in high-risk behaviors that are self-destructive. So anger takes a great many forms, but in all of them, if it's not processed in a healthy manner, it becomes a very, very destructive thing. And if I told you all the stories I've heard over the years of people whose lives have been negatively impacted by anger in a very significant way, we'd be here throughout the whole week. And so it's no accident that Jesus starts with anger today. Many of us believe that Jesus is the Son of God. We worship Jesus. But I don't know that we always appreciate that Jesus was also brilliant. And this passage here and how he develops it is an example of Jesus' brilliance. This passage, these words, they come in the context of the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount is Matthew chapter 5, 6, 7, 3 chapters. In it, Jesus is talking about life lived in harmony with God's principle and God's ways as alternative to life as lived in sort of the unthinking, uncritical ways of the world around us. And so the Sermon on the Mount starts off with the Beatitudes. There's the values in God's kingdom. So blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall see God. That's a value that when people are peacemakers are living in harmony with the heart of God, as opposed to the world around us, which is always looking for ways to make war and to pursue our own way at the expense of other people's ways. It goes on from there. Last week we talked about salt and light being the salt of the earth, the light of the world. And we talked about building a better fire. Lots of people are lighting fires, but those fires aren't necessarily shining with the light of love. So we need to build a better fire that people are drawn to it. And then Jesus goes on and the rubber really hits the road. And this is where the Sermon on the Mount gets difficult. And it is. And today's going to be something of a deep dive. I mean, you can do with what you will. You can sort of leave it on a superficial level. But if we follow Jesus, you really can't remain on a superficial level. And at this point, this gets to be a very challenging passage, as are the things that come after it. And these two verses, they set us up for everything that comes afterwards. And if we don't get these two verses right, this is why Jesus starts here. He knows that we're not going to be able to get anything else right. You know, if we can't learn to process anger in a constructive way, we're never going to grow into any relational depth with other people. And so Jesus starts here. And so for instance, a few verses later, Jesus is going to say that familiar verse. If a soldier orders you to carry their pack for a mile, don't just carry it for a mile, carry it for 2 miles. Don't just go the 1 mile, go the extra mile. That's where that saying comes from. And this is part of Jesus' vision, that God's kingdom, that God's family, that the new community that Jesus is trying to create is going to be made up of people from every different perspective, race, inclination, you name it. It's not just going to be Jews. It's also going to be Romans. It's not just going to be Greeks. It's going to be Hebrews. It's not just going to be slaves. It's going to be free people. And the day will come when there won't be any slaves anymore. And so this is the vision of God's kingdom, that all these different groups are going to come together. And so when Jesus is going to say to somebody, when Jesus talks about carrying a pack, he's talking about a Roman soldier compelling a Jewish citizen to carry the military paraphernalia. And he wants them to do that as followers of Jesus, to reach out to the Romans and draw them into a loving relationship so that a new community can be established where all people are part of one human family. Love everybody all the time, everywhere, as we often say. But a person, if they're angry, if they look at that Roman soldier and all they can say, which is what most Jews in that day would have said, if when they saw a Roman soldier, a red haze just dropped in front of their lives, and they thought, you uncircumcised pig, then that person is never, ever, ever going to listen to Jesus' word that they need to go that extra mile. Jesus, you're crazy. You know, what wine have you been drinking, Jesus? I might carry it for that 1 mile, kicking and screaming the whole way, but I'm not carrying it another inch for that uncircumcised pig. Right? If the person can't begin to deal with anger, they're never going to be able to process the things that Jesus is going to say after that. That's why he starts with anger. It's the fundamental, core, relational competency. And that is true in your relationships too. And, you know, it's true of the world on the macro level, but every level down, every level of granularity we go down, it's going to be true. It's going to be true of countries. It's going to be true of communities. It's going to be true of churches. It's going to be true of families. And it's going to be true of our own interior life. If we can't learn on the most granular level of all, our own lives, if we can't learn to manage our own anger, it's going to create great problems. And in some ways, this message is particularly for men. Because men historically have the greatest problems with anger. And statistically have the greatest problems with anger. And this is just one of those times that I wish men could do my job with me. Because when we so often see how much, when I see how much, what a toll it takes for women living with angry men. And remember, it's not always raging men. It's just sometimes emotionally unavailable men. Both are expressions of anger, and both are incredibly painful and incredibly are a great burden. And when I see that, it just breaks my heart, and I think, boy, I absolutely do not want to be that person. I just absolutely do not want to be that person. And living in Florida, you know, I lived in Florida for many years, where we'd sometimes do 3 funerals in a day. When I'd see so many of these nice women for whom I had the deepest respect, and they were nice, sweet women. They loved their husbands, but they suffered so long, carrying such burdens that with living with angry men, that when their husbands were gone, they just appreciated the release. And again, I just looked at that and said, boy, I just don't want that to me. And I don't think you want that to be you either. We know, statistically speaking, men are larger than women. That means we have larger heads than women have. Again, on average. And that means, and this may surprise you, that we actually have bigger brains than women have. But here's the part that won't surprise you. Our frontal cortex, where all the higher level processing goes, is smaller than women's. Women's have, over the ages, have more highly developed the frontal cortex, the higher reasoning processes of the brain. And the amygdala, which nobody had heard of the amygdala 20 years ago. Now the amygdala is all the rage. The lizard brain, the most primitive part of our brain, tucked right at the base of our spinal stem. Men in our amygdala, we actually have a whole bunch of receptors that receive sexual input, which means testosterone. And so the thing that really drives our emotion is bathed in testosterone, and testosterone is not about getting along, right? It's a survival skill, and believe it or not, the kind of withdrawal that you'll see in so many men, it's a testosterone-driven thing. Shutting down conversation, not being good at conversation, that's a potentially a testosterone-driven thing. Because if I'm talking to somebody, I'm not prepared to deal with a threat. And if I like somebody and that person is a threat to me, I'm not going to be as able to dispatch of that person, whatever it means to dispatch that person. So women are physiologically and evolutionarily designed to connect, to create communities that help them process anger. Men, we're designed and programmed and reinforced to act on it, to compete, and to get to the top of the heap, because that's how we ensure that our genes get passed on. And so again, all that is just to say that anger is a particular challenge for men. And I hope that we take that seriously. Those who are listening to us take it seriously. And even our young men who are attending today, I hope you'll listen to this because you're likely going to have some challenges in front of you. Okay, so this passage, I'd suggest you memorize it. I think it's worth memorizing. I think it's worth knowing. You've heard it said in ancient times, you shall not murder, but anybody who murders is liable to judgment. But I say to you, Jesus goes on, that if you just call your brother, or if you're angry with your brother or sister, you are liable to judgment. Doesn't matter if you murdered anybody or not. Most of us aren't going to murder anybody. We're not going to do that damage, but we may well do a whole bunch of even greater damage through our anger. I am liable to judgment. And if you insult your brother or sister, you are liable to the council. And if you call another a fool, which was a strong word in biblical literature, there's a whole book devoted in the Bible to not being a fool. And a fool was basically somebody who was regarded as subhuman, and therefore they deserved any attitude we might have towards them, any words we might speak about them, any behaviors we might enact towards them. That's the kind of thing that regarding somebody. And if you regard somebody as a fool, you are liable to the hell of fire. And the word here is Gehenna. It's not actually a biblical word for hell. It was a garbage dump, a literal place, a garbage dump outside of Jerusalem. It was filled with putrid garbage and stunk and burned. And again, it becomes this metaphor for the impact that anger can have on our lives. And we think that this other person is the problem. That's why we're angry with them. But what Jesus is saying, it's not the other person who's in danger of the fire of hell. It's you. It's not the other person who's the problem. It's you. It's me who's the problem. And one of our St. Matthew sayings, we just say this over and over again because it's so counterintuitive, but there's so much truth in this, and it's so hard to get this, that if we see the problem is out there, that's the problem. Because the problem, 9 times out of 10, is going to be in here. Sometimes, yes, it's out there. But most of the time, it's in here. So we can, even in these, and there's so much, even in these 2 verses, I mean, we could talk for the next hour. We won't. We're only going to go probably 45 minutes. But there's so much in these. And so, for instance, one of the first things we learn is that there are stages to anger. So there's these 3 stages. It starts with being angry, goes to an insult, and then it goes to seeing somebody as subhuman. It progresses on to contempt, to hostility. Hostility, contempt, and anger. If anger's not dealt with, it's always going to progress into hostility and into contempt. And so the first part, and so the important thing is to catch anger early on, to nip it in the bud. There are all kinds of anger scales. And generally those scales run, 1 to 10, something like that. They'll start with something like, I'm angry sometimes, I'm angry pretty often, I'm angry a lot, I'm angry all the time to the point that I just can't stand myself. And some people really get to that point, more people than you might know. And so the trick is to catch anger. If it's a scale of 1 to 10, it's to catch it way back at 2 or 3 and deal with it accordingly. Anger is a feeling. It's an emotion, like every other emotion. And so if we can catch it early and process it early, it passes through us. But if we don't, and the word that Jesus used for anger is actually an ongoing anger. It's not a punctiliar thing, like puncturing a balloon at one time. It's an ongoing anger. That's where anger becomes so destructive, when it's not dealt with. And the only way to deal with it is to catch it really early on and say, what's going on here? And it's interesting. If you are angry with somebody, it says you are liable to judgment. You won't necessarily be judged. Depends on what you do with your anger. And why would we be judged? Because so often, the things that we're angry with somebody else about are the things that we don't like in ourselves. But we can't own them in ourselves. We're too threatened by them in ourselves. We can't see them in ourselves, and so we need to project them out onto other people. And we get angry with other people, but where we're really angry is here. And so in that moment when we get angry, if we can just stop and say, what's going on here? We often think anger is a who? My husband, my wife, my kid, my dad, my boss, my pastor, my whatever it might be. But anger is very rarely a who. It is almost always a what. And that what isn't out there. It is often in here. And so if we can catch it early on. Anger it's a painful emotion that says there's a need. That's what it is. It's a signal. It's a painful emotion that says there's a need. And that need, most of the time, isn't out there. It's in here. And we need to identify that need and deal with it. And sometimes it might be as simple as just getting more sleep. Okay, so whether we progress on from that, first thing, anger is a scale. And we want to catch our anger early on. And we want to deal with it early on, so that it doesn't progress into contempt and hatred. Second thing is that anger is if this is the only thing you take, I hope you'll take this. I can't remember where I read this, but this has been one of the most helpful concepts of my life, frankly. And it is that we tend to farm anger out to our body. So anger tends to reside in our body rather than our minds, rather than in our hearts. Anger maybe starts here, but we farm it out to our body so that that's the only place that it's now getting processed, in our physiological responses. And that is one of the most foolish things we can do, is to farm anger out to our body so we're no longer mindful of it. We're just mindlessly rehearsing it, allowing those physical processes to deepen and get stronger. And when that happens, you see, because we're no longer using our mind, because we're no longer using our spirit, we're not being critical of what's happening in us, of what's causing that anger. We feel increasingly justified in our anger. Have you ever met somebody who was really angry and didn't feel entirely justified? And even more, if they were really angry and they were taking some sort of posture or behavior or action towards somebody else who didn't feel entirely justified? And that's what it means to farm anger out to our bodies. It's now bypassed our minds. Our minds don't have anything to do with it anymore. And what Jesus wants us to do, and this is what you'll see as you read on the Sermon on the Mount, is he wants to take anger back and have us put it squarely in the context of our spiritual life. Because it turns out anger is a deeply spiritual thing. Somebody said, and I think this is really good, is that we can understand God as good, orderly direction, and we can understand ego as what's ego? I forget.
Easing God out.
Easing God out. Thank you. Yes, that is exactly it. I appreciate that. The ego is easing God out. And see, that's the spiritual thing. When we ease God out, then we're able to just do what we want to do. But when we're subject to something greater than ourselves, then we get good, orderly direction. And so, again, we want to take whatever it is that's making us angry, bring it into the context of our spiritual life, to step out of our anger. For people of faith, if you're a person of faith, in particular, if you're a person who follows Jesus, then part of what we said when we follow Jesus is, not my will be done, but your will be done, O Lord. And so, the things that make us, so we, instead of easing God out, we want to submit ourselves to God's purposes in our lives. and those things come up that make us angry, we can say, I don't have to have my way. Did Jesus want to die on the cross? No. He did not want to die on the cross. Remember the Garden of Gethsemane? Lord, if I don't have to do this, please don't make me do it. But if I must, your will be done, not mine. My will is not to go be brutally murdered and suffered. My will is to be spared that. But if there's some greater purpose in all this, then not my will, but your will be done. And as Christians, the Bible talks about our being crucified with Christ. We don't talk about that much anymore. But it's a way of saying, not my will, but God's will. And so and we hope to come to the point in our spiritual life where I am done with content. Where I am done with the kind of anger that leads to contempt. Do we have a right to it? Perhaps. Is there a place for it? Perhaps. But anything that's done in anger can always be done better outside of anger. And so again, remember this. Do not farm anger out to your body, where it just becomes an automatic response. Keep it in the context of your mind, or even better, your spiritual life, in light of your relationship with God. And then the final thing is not to allow ourselves to view people as objects rather than as people. To remember that people are people. To remember that our children are people. Sometimes we forget that. Remember that our parents are people. Sometimes that never even occurred to us. Sometimes, to remember that, that the people that we are so quick to demonize are people too, and are subject to the same challenges and as we are. I remember in my first church, I was young, 27 years old. There was, I had a vision for what I wanted the church to be. I was probably very insecure. And there was a guy, I won't say his name just in case he happens to be listening. You never know when you're on the internet. But I just saw him as a real obstacle to what I wanted to do. And so he always made me angry. And then one night it was after a Monday, Thursday service, and we were staying in the church to pray, and he went up to the altar to pray, and he was an older man, a World War II vet, and in that dim light, I could just see how frail he was, and he had an old war wound, and he walked with a limp, and as he walked up there, and in that context, all of a sudden, I stopped seeing him as an obstacle to what an insecure young man wanted to do, and I started to see him as a person. And my heart just began to go out to him. And I sat there and I felt compassion and love begin to well up. And from that moment, we began to cultivate a kind of relationship we never had. I went to his house. His house was a shack. He didn't have any money. And I just kind of fell in love with him. And I think maybe he fell a little bit in love with me. And we found a way ahead where he was no longer an obstacle, but where we were united in the family of Christ, in this new community, as the people that God wanted us to be. So we live in this day and age, and it doesn't matter if you're on the right and left. We just have this terrible, terrible, terrible tendency right now to dehumanize, to demonize, to vilify. And, it gets expressed in our words. I mean, if we're not saying you fool, we're pretty darn close. And so it's an invitation. It's an invitation to reflect, and it's an invitation to pray, to meditate, and to see people as people. To realize that no matter what's going on, there is always a person inside. And when we can see that, it doesn't necessarily excuse anything, but it gives us a way to relate in compassion rather than in anger. Friends, I frankly think pretty much everything hangs on this. And so it really is my prayer that as we read these words of Jesus, that they will speak to our hearts. And that we will make managing anger one of the highest priorities of our life. And that we might relate to one another in the ways that God just dreams that we relate to each other, instead of frustrating ourselves, hurting ourselves and others, and breaking the heart of God. Amen.